All right, so let's jump right in to the situation in Ukraine. You've probably been following the news, so you know that things are getting pretty tense. Today, we're going to go deeper than the headlines, though. We really want to unpack what's been happening lately and try to figure out just how serious all this could actually become. We've got reports on a new hypersonic missile from Russia. There are threats about cyber warfare against the UK, and we're even going to hear some pretty strong opinions about whether or not this is already World War III.
Yeah, and what's really striking here is how all of these things seem to be connected. It's not like these are just isolated incidents. It feels like we're seeing a much broader strategy unfolding.
Yeah, let's start with Putin's announcement about this new missile. It's called the Oreshnik. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, you got Oreshnik.
Oreshnik, which means hazel tree. It was apparently fired at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. And get this, it can supposedly reach speeds of 13,000 kilometers per hour. But here's the scary part. Putin himself has said that there's no way to stop it with current air defense systems.
And that's not just Putin trying to sound tough. Military experts like Michael Bioner from the RAND Corporation are suggesting that this might be a very deliberate move on Putin's part. Like he wants to project an image of strength at a time when he might actually be feeling vulnerable. Especially given all of Ukraine's recent successes on the battlefield.
So it's like a show of force, but with a weapon that's terrifyingly real. And the fact that experts in Ukraine are right now analyzing debris from the missile makes it all the more real, right?
Absolutely. It definitely adds a very real layer of fear to the situation. This isn't just hypothetical. This is a real weapon with the potential to cause some serious damage.
And then on top of all that, you've got this cyber warfare threat hanging over the UK. Got McFadden, the UK minister who's responsible for national security, issued a pretty serious warning. He said that Russia is totally prepared to launch cyber attacks that could cripple their critical infrastructure. I mean, they could potentially leave millions of people without power.
And this warning came directly from a NATO cybersecurity conference. So it really shows you how worried all the Western allies are. This isn't just a threat to the UK, it's a threat to all of NATO and their ability to help Ukraine.
And it's not just empty threats either. There have already been reports of cyber attacks that are linked to coalition groups. They've been targeting local councils in the UK. What's really concerning, though, is that these attacks could actually impact civilians who are miles away from the fighting in Ukraine.
Right. If Russia actually manages to hit critical infrastructure, the disruption would be huge. It would be incredibly unsettling and widespread. It really makes you realize how much the lines are blurring between conventional warfare and cyber
Yeah, it
warfare.
really makes you wonder, at what point does something like this officially become a global war?
That's a tough question to answer, and it's definitely a question that people are debating right now. Putin himself has said that this conflict already has a global character. He says it's because Ukraine used long-range missiles backed by the U.S. to strike inside Russia.
And he's also using the involvement of other countries as proof, like North Korea, which is supposedly sending troops to fight with the Russians, and Iran, which is still supplying weapons. There's even a former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army who's flat out said that World War III has already started.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering thought. And it really shows you just how easily this whole thing could spiral out of control. Now, NATO hasn't officially called it World War III yet, but they definitely recognize that the risk is growing.
So then what actually makes something a global war? Is it how many countries are involved? Is it the scale of the fighting? Is it the types of weapons that are being used?
It's probably a mix of all those things, but in this case, the fact that other nations are involved, plus the fact that they're using really advanced weapons and that everything could escalate even further, it definitely raises the stakes.
Okay, so let's change gears a little bit here. Let's talk about Donald Trump's proposed peace plan. Now that he's back in office, this plan is back on the table. And it's definitely generating a lot of discussion.
The plan is basically built around three main things. First, there would be a ceasefire along the lines where the fighting is happening right now. Then they'd set up a demilitarized zone to separate the two sides. And finally, Ukraine would have to agree to stay neutral. That means they couldn't join NATO.
It sounds pretty bold, but what's the thinking behind it? Is this just about appeasing Putin?
I think it's more complicated than that. It probably appeals to the part of Trump's base that's very isolationist, the people who don't want to get entangled in foreign conflicts. It could also mean that the U.S. would spend less on military aid, and it might mean that they'd be less reliant on resources from other countries.
Okay, but would Russia and Ukraine actually agree to something like this?
That's the million-dollar question. Russia might like some parts of it, but it doesn't really give them everything they want. They've said that they want full control of the four regions that they annexed, and this plan doesn't give them that. Ukraine, on the other hand, would probably feel a lot of pressure to accept it, especially if they were threatened with cuts to their aid.
It's definitely a controversial plan, and it's really hard to say how it would actually play out. Speaking of powerful players, though, there's one more we need to talk about: China. They've been pretty quiet about this conflict, but their actions are speaking volumes.
Yeah, China's military power is growing rapidly,
Yeah.
especially their navy, and that's a huge factor in all of this. Their shipbuilding program is just massive. It's been reported that they can build ships at a rate 230 times greater than the U.S.
Wow, that's a crazy statistic. What does that actually mean, though, in practical terms?
Well, it means that they can expand their navy incredibly quickly, they can project their power all over the region, and they could even challenge the U.S. Navy's dominance. This has major implications for regional security, especially in places like Taiwan, the Philippines, and the South China Sea. These are areas where China is becoming more and more assertive.
So it's not just about Ukraine anymore. It's like we're watching a global arms race. There are multiple potential flashpoints, and there's just so much uncertainty about the future. It's a lot to wrap your head around,
Yep.
and we've really only scratched the surface here.
Yeah, it really is a lot. And one of the things that worries me the most is this whole cyber warfare thing. We know that Russia has the ability to do it, and they're clearly not afraid to use these tactics. And like we said before, it's not just military targets they're going after.
Right. It's scary to think that they could disrupt critical infrastructure and that it could affect regular people who are nowhere near the fighting in Ukraine.
And the other tricky thing is that it's really hard to prove who's behind these attacks. You've got these pro-Russian groups operating in the shadows. They can launch these really sophisticated attacks, and it's almost impossible to trace them back to the Kremlin.
So it's like a secret war happening in the digital world, but with real-world consequences that could be devastating.
Exactly. They could target anything: power grids, financial systems, communication networks, transportation infrastructure. Imagine what would happen if they took down the power grid in a major city, or if they shut down all financial transactions.
It's a pretty chilling thought. It really makes you realize how vulnerable we all are in this hyper-connected world. But hey, in the midst of all this bad news, there's a report that Ukraine might have actually managed to hit back pretty hard. They might have taken out one of Russia's most advanced air defense systems, the S-400.
Oh, wow. If that's true, that could be a major turning point. The S-400 is one of Russia's most powerful weapons. It's a long-range surface-to-air missile system. It's supposed to protect against all kinds of aerial threats: planes, missiles, drones, you name it.
So if Ukraine actually took one of these things out, what does that mean strategically?
Well, it could make Russia a lot more vulnerable. It could give Ukraine's Air Force a lot more freedom to operate. And it could be a real morale booster for Ukraine and their allies. It would show that Russia's defenses aren't invincible.
But you know Russia's not just going to sit back and do nothing.
Yeah.
They're going to try to regain the upper hand somehow,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. It's a very fluid situation. And you can bet that Russia will respond. They might deploy more air defense systems, change their tactics, maybe even launch a counterattack.
It's like a constant back and forth, like a really dangerous game of chess with incredibly high stakes.
Exactly. And as the stakes get higher, the chances of someone making a mistake or things spiraling out of control also increase. That's why communication and diplomacy are more important now than ever.
It's hard to imagine either side being willing to talk right now.
Yeah.
I mean, the rhetoric is so heated and there's so much mistrust.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. But like I said before, the alternative is just unthinkable.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Russia and what they're up to, but what about China? They've been pretty quiet publicly, but they've been making some big moves militarily. You can't ignore that.
Right. China's playing the long game here. That huge shipbuilding program they've got going is a clear sign that they want to be a major global power.
And that's going to have a big impact on the balance of power in the world, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. It feels like we're heading towards a global arms race.
It's definitely a valid concern. China's growing military power combined with Russia's aggression and everything that's happening in Ukraine, it creates a very complex and potentially dangerous situation. To really understand what's going on here, though, we need to look at the historical and political context.
Okay, so we need to look beyond the headlines. We need to understand the underlying tensions and historical grievances that have been brewing for years.
Exactly. Russia's actions in Ukraine are partly driven by this deep-seated fear of NATO expansion. They want to control what they see as their historical sphere of influence.
So it's about security and control.
Yeah.
But it's also about projecting this image of strength It's about trying to make Russia great again.
Exactly. Putin has been very careful to create this narrative of national strength and revival. And the conflict in Ukraine plays right into that narrative. It allows him to portray himself as the strong leader who's defending Russia against the West.
But at what cost? I mean, the human cost of this war is already astronomical.
Yeah.
And the economic and social consequences are massive.
Yeah, the cost is immeasurable. Lives, lost families, displaced economies, shattered, an entire region destabilized. It's a tragic reminder of the devastating impact of war.
So, given all of this, is there any hope for a peaceful resolution? Is there any way out of this mess?
It's hard to say. Any lasting peace would require both sides to compromise. Russia would probably have to give up some of its territorial ambitions, and Ukraine might have to accept some limitations on its sovereignty, like maybe agreeing not to join NATO.
But we talked about this earlier. Right now, both sides think they can win militarily. And with so much at stake for both Putin and Zelensky, it's hard to imagine either of them backing down.
That's true. And we also can't forget about the role that other countries are playing. The U.S. and its allies are still supporting Ukraine, and that's a big factor in how this conflict is playing out.
So if a negotiated settlement is unlikely anytime soon, what are the other scenarios?
Well, one possibility is that the conflict escalates even further. It could draw in other countries and lead to a much wider war. Like we mentioned before, there are already North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces, and Iran is still supplying weapons to Russia. That's not a good sign.
And then there's the possibility that Russia and NATO end up in a direct military confrontation. What if Russia accidentally attacks a NATO member? That would trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty,
Yeah.
and then all the NATO countries would be obligated to respond.
Yeah, that's the nightmare scenario. A full-scale war between Russia and NATO would be catastrophic, not just for those countries, but for the whole world. And then there's the risk of nuclear war. That's something we can't ignore.
It doesn't even bear thinking about. But there's also the possibility that the fighting drags on. Maybe it becomes a stalemate with no clear winner.
That could happen. But it wouldn't be a good outcome. A long, drawn-out conflict would just keep draining resources. It would destabilize the entire region, and it would cause immense suffering for the people of Ukraine. Plus, there's always the risk that someone makes a mistake and things escalate anyway. What if there's an accidental strike on a NATO border post? That could set off a chain reaction that no one could stop.
Right. It really shows you how fragile peace is and how important diplomacy and communication are and how important it is for everyone to respect international norms. But as we've seen, all of those things can go out the window when tensions are high and when national interests are on the line.
That's why it's so important for everyone to stay informed, to have thoughtful discussions about these issues, and to push for peaceful solutions. We might feel like our voices are small, but together we can make a difference.
You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. It's easy to feel like there's nothing we can do as individuals to change things.
I get it. But it's important to remember that we're not powerless. Our choices matter. Our voices matter. We can support organizations that are working for peace. We can talk to our elected officials. And we can refuse to accept that violence is the only answer. Even small actions can make a difference.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about. We've talked about how cyber warfare could disrupt our lives, how dangerous these hypersonic missiles are, and how China's military is getting stronger and stronger. It's a pretty complicated and honestly kind of scary picture of the world right now.
Yeah, no doubt. It's like the lines between these regional conflicts and these global power struggles are just getting blurrier and blurrier. And like we've been saying, the chances of something going wrong and this whole thing escalating are very real.
So looking ahead, what are some of the things that could happen? What does the future hold for this conflict and for the world in general?
Well, one possibility, and it might be a long shot at this point, is that they somehow manage to negotiate a peace deal. But that would require both sides to give up a lot. Russia would probably have to scale back its territorial goals, and Ukraine might have to accept some limits on its sovereignty. Like maybe they'd have to agree to not join NATO.
But like we said earlier, both sides seem to think they can win this thing militarily.
Yeah.
And with so much at stake for both Putin and Zelensky, it's hard to imagine either one of them being willing to make those kinds of compromises.
True. And we can't forget about the influence of other countries like the U.S. and its allies. The fact that they're still supporting Ukraine has a huge impact on the situation.
So if a peace deal isn't likely anytime soon, what other scenarios should we be thinking about?
One possibility that's a lot more worrisome is that the conflict keeps escalating. It could draw in other countries and turn into a much bigger war. The fact that there are already North Korean troops fighting with the Russians and that Iran is still giving them weapons is a pretty bad sign.
And then there's always the risk that Russia and NATO end up in a direct military confrontation. What happens if Russia attacks a NATO country? Even if it's an accident,
Yeah.
it would trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty, and then all the NATO countries would have to respond.
Yeah, that's the worst case scenario. A
Yeah.
full-blown war between Russia and NATO would be a disaster. Not just for those countries, but for the entire world. And then there's the whole nuclear weapons issue. We can't forget about that.
It's terrifying to even think about. But there's also the possibility that the conflict just drags on. Maybe it becomes a stalemate where nobody really wins.
That could happen, but it wouldn't be a good thing. A long conflict would just keep draining resources and destabilizing the region,
Yeah.
and the people of Ukraine would keep suffering. Plus, there's always that risk that someone makes a mistake and things escalate anyway. What if there's an accidental strike on a NATO border post that could set off a chain reaction that nobody could control?
Right. It really highlights how fragile peace is and how important it is to keep lines of communication open and to work towards diplomatic solutions. And everyone needs to respect international norms. But like we've seen, those things can go out the window pretty quickly when tensions are running high and national interests are at stake.
That's why it's so important for everyone to stay informed, to have these tough conversations about what's going on, and to push for peaceful solutions. We might feel like our voices don't matter, but together we can make a difference.
You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. It can feel like there's nothing we can do as individuals to change things.
I know, but it's important to remember that we're not powerless. Our choices matter. Our voices matter. We can support organizations that are working for peace. We can talk to our elected officials. And we can refuse to accept that violence is the only answer. Every little bit helps.
Those are some really important things to remember. It's easy to lose hope when things look this bad. We've spent a lot of time in this deep dive looking at the rising tensions, the threats that are out there, and all the different ways this conflict could play out. It's been sobering conversation, but it's important to have these conversations.
I agree. It's important to be aware of what's happening in the world and to understand the challenges we're facing.
Exactly. So as we wrap things up here, the big question remains, what role will each of the players in this conflict choose to take? Will they try to find a peaceful solution, or will they keep pushing towards war? And maybe even more importantly, what role will each of us choose to take? Will we just sit back and watch as things unfold, or will we actually try to make a difference and work towards a more peaceful and just world?
That's the question we all need to ask ourselves.
Hmm?
What kind of world do we want to live in? And what are we willing to do to make that world a reality?
That's a perfect place to leave it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has given you some things to think about. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.